Okay, we are going to go over these notes for chapter 2.4 and make sure that you have all the right answers and that you know what's going on. So, we've been talking about the first governments that we've had in our country's history. We had the government under the Articles of Confederation. Now, we're going to move on to talking about the Constitutional Convention. So, when our country was founded and we had the revolution going on, they started the Articles of Confederation. We've looked at how weak the Articles were and how it really could not govern the country well. So, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, in particular, really pushed for a convention to draw up a new constitution. However, they knew that most people, or at least a significant number of people, would not want a new constitution or get rid of articles. So they just sold it as a meeting to help people figure out ways that they can improve the Articles of Confederation. And then they wound up drafting the entire Constitution. So why did the Constitutional Convention draft a new plan for government? Well, let's just look at this. I'm going to put it in red so you'll know that you need to put this in your answers. So why did they do that? Well, first of all, the country was on the verge of crisis. There were lots of problems going on, things that the articles just were not able to handle because the national government was not strong enough to deal with rebellions and things like that. And there had been rebellions, there had been different problems going on. States were at each other's throats, so there were a lot of crises going on. Also, the Articles of Confederation. Yep, there we go. Confederation was too weak to meet the nation's needs. And so those are the things you need to know about why they drafted that. So once the Constitutional Convention got started in Philadelphia in 1787, what was their procedure for voting? How did they go about doing that? Well, each state had delegates. Delegates are basically representatives. Okay, so they sent delegates that would represent their state, but each state only got one vote. So the delegates in that state would then have to decide amongst themselves how their state was going to vote. So I guess the state would take a vote in its own delegation, and then whoever won that, that's who would get the state's vote. And then they had a simple majority to make the decisions. Okay, so 50% of the vote plus one would win the vote. Okay, now describe the Virginia Plan. Now, the Virginia Plan was a plan that was favored by the large states because Virginia at the time was the largest state. Okay, and there are a lot of details about the Virginia Plan and on number 4, the New Jersey Plan, that we're simply not going to get into. We don't really need to know all of that, but let's talk about the Virginia Plan. And like I said, this was favored by the large states because the plans benefited them quite a bit. So what was the Virginia Plan? It had a strong central government. Okay, what else did it have? It had a bicameral legislature. Bicameral means 2 houses. But what you need to know is that representation was based on population. Okay, so in the large states, in both the upper house and the lower house, what we would call the Senate and the House of Representatives is the name they eventually settled on. Each of those would be based on population. So, of course, the large states are going to favor that because, they have more people. They can have more representatives in the legislature, and therefore they have more weight. And that kind of does make sense if you look at it from the perspective of one person, one vote kind of way. But you can see why the small states were not in favor of this. They didn't like it at all because, they were afraid that the large states would bowl them over. Okay, think about it today. California has 40 plus million people. Wyoming, I think, is our least populous state, and they have 500 and something thousand. That's a huge difference. And if the government were based entirely on population, poor Wyoming, Rhode Island, Maine, some of those smaller states, Hawaii, Alaska, wouldn't even have a say in our government. And so that's what the small states like New Jersey and others were worried about. So what was the New Jersey Plan? What did the small states favor? They wanted a strong, I put it in red, They wanted a strong central government as well. They wanted a bicameral legislature. Nope, sorry, they wanted unicameral. Legislature. That means there was only one house, was what they wanted. Each state had equal representation. Okay, so every state would get the same number of votes no matter what, whether it was one per state or two per state or whatever. So they favored that. There were other things as well, and there are things we could talk about, like the New Jersey plan wanted more than one president. The Virginia plan was unclear on that. So there were lots of other details we're just not going to simply get into. But the New Jersey plan, basically you need to know one of the strong central government, unicameral legislature, each state had equal representation. Now large states are looking at that, well, that's not fair because your small states with 500,000 people, in today's terms, back then it would have been a lot less, would basically control our government. That's not fair to us with all of our people. So there was this battle. What you need to understand is that our founding fathers, as wise as they were, they didn't all agree on everything, okay? And when they were at the Constitutional Convention, they debated and discussed and had lots of issues that they had to work out. And they did it. They compromised, which is why we have something called the Great Compromise. And so here I have for you to explain the Great Compromise in detail. So let's look at what the Great Compromise was. It combined elements from Virginia plan and New Jersey plan. Okay, it had a bicameral legislature. Upper house would give each state 2 representatives. So the Senate is what it came to be known as, has 2 senators per state, regardless. And this is, the Senate was originally meant to be representative of the states and not the people. And so the state legislatures elected the senators. Okay, now that changed with the 17th Amendment in 1913, 1914, somewhere around there. It's a popular vote. But the Senate originally represented the states, so each state got the same number of votes. Lower house would get would be represented by population. So each, however many people you had, that was determined how many representatives you got. So that's the House of Representatives. Something about the state, I'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, represented by population. So today, for instance, Texas has 36 representatives in the House. Wyoming has 1. California has 53. Florida has 27. And it's based on population. But in the Senate, every state gets 2. Okay? Senators elected every 6 years. Representatives elected every 2 years. Okay. Now on the Senate, the senators were on a rotating basis. So only 1/3 of senators are ever up for re-election at any given time, no more than 33 or 34 at the max. Okay. Unless there's some odd circumstance that goes on. So that is something else they had. There would be 1 president and 1 vice president. Okay. The Electoral College elected the president, and we'll talk more about that at some point. So don't worry about that so much. But the Electoral College elected the president. We had a Supreme Court and any other courts the legislature establishes. So lower courts would be established by the legislature. Let's see if there's anything else. I mean, there's lots of more details, but these are the main things you need to know about it. Okay, so what were the compromises related to counting slaves and for taxation purposes and for representation purposes? So the southern states wanted slaves to be counted in full, 100% of them, for representation. Now, they would never get to vote, according to them, wouldn't actually represent them, but they wanted representation in Congress based upon the number of slaves they had. And the northern states were like, that's not fair. They're not going to get to be represented. You consider them your property, and so they shouldn't get to count for representation. The northern states, because the way the taxation was originally set up, is states would be taxed based upon population. So the northern states were like, well, you should be taxed, your slaves should be counted in full for for taxation. And the southern states, well, that's not fair. So they couldn't agree. And so they came up with the 3/5 compromise. Okay, and basically, 3/5 of slaves would be counted for taxation and representation. Okay, and that was something that has been criticized much today, and it is something that's terrible. But I want you to look at it this way. Slaves were not considered people. And so today we hear people say, they were only considered 3/5 of a person, and that's terrible. Yes, it is. But that was an improvement from where it was. So it was already beginning to see this movement towards that. Also, Congress could not restrict slavery or slave trade for 20 years. Okay, basically they had to compromise on slave issues, because if they didn't, there would be no union. And people criticized these compromises, but it was either we're going to have a country and we're going to have to compromise, or we're not going to have a country. And of course, number 7 is the answer I just gave you. What was agreed to about the slave trade? No laws restricting slave trade for 20 years. Okay. How do the delegates determine the president should be elected, and why? Well, they wanted to do a popular vote. Some of the large states did, because that was part of the Virginia plan. But the small states were like, if you do that, we'll never get a vote. Okay. And I want you to think about that. People today criticize the Electoral College, and I asked you to write an essay about that. But the Electoral College really does help, because remember, we are not a democracy. Our founding fathers did not like the idea of democracy. They wanted a republic, which would give minority rights to people that were not in the majority. And so they came up with the Electoral College in order to allow the small states to have some say in electing the president, because today your small states like Wyoming, Rhode Island, Nebraska, some of those small states would never get a say in the president if we didn't have the Electoral College. Your largest states, 4 or 5 top largest states, California, New Mexico, New York, Texas, Florida, Illinois, those would be the ones who would elect the president every time. I mean, you think about Dallas, Texas, and the number of people it has like 4 or 5 times the number of people that some states have. So the small states thought that was not fair. So in order to give small states a voice in electing the president, they came up with the Electoral College. Okay, now, how does that work? Okay, the Electoral College works by, all right, let's go there. Okay, each state, and each state determines how to select its own electors. But today, the way it's done, each state gives its electors to the person who wins the popular vote in that state. Okay, so like Texas was carried by Trump, so Trump got Texas electors. California was carried by Clinton, so I'm sorry, that was 2016, by Biden in 2020, and so California's electors went to Biden. Okay, each state, and you need to make sure you know this, gets 1 elector for every senator and representative it has. So Texas has 36 representatives and 2 senators. So we get how many? 38 electoral votes. Okay, so that's how that works. All right, make sure you fill in all these answers and submit this for a grade. Hope you have a good day. Let me know if you have any questions.